Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world. I do hope you're doing incredibly well. I'm doing great, thank you very much. And what a lovely day it is today. I don't know where you are, but where I am, the weather is absolutely perfect. The sky is the most gorgeous blue colour, and everything just looks so delightful today. And I hope you can say the same about where you are. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and make sure you go and get yourself something really lovely to drink. I have a cup of hot chai tea with me right now, a mixture of cinnamon, ginger, allspice, all those lovely flavours with a frothy milk, and it's absolutely delicious. So if you're drinking something unusual, let me know about it. So let's get started with our story tonight, shall we? And for those of you who like to be spooked, this is the story for you. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners. Growing up, I never believed in anything paranormal or outer-worldly, but then I guess the rigidly structured environment from which I was raised did very little to open my mind to such possibilities. I certainly did not believe in cryptic creatures of any kind, like Bigfoot, Dogman, or the Wendigo. I was raised by straight-laced, very liberal parents who arrogantly believed everyone else was wrong and they were right about almost everything. Anyone who didn't agree with their opinions on things from politics to anything else besides was clearly very unenlightened, completely ignorant and uneducated. I hasten to say that my parents' stinking attitudes over almost everything ignorantly reflected that they believed they were superior to anyone in society who didn't have a university degree behind them, which was absolutely ridiculous. It made them come across as entitled, unenlightened, and incredibly snooty, and could serve to really ruffle my feathers at times. But I chose wisely not to confront them about their biased viewpoints, from religion to the paranormal, science, and politics. For let's just say challenging my father, who could be dictatorially persuasive and stubbornly unyielding at the best of times, would be tantamount to wrestling a very aggrieved, bad-tempered tiger, or possibly just putting my hand down the waste disposal unit in our kitchen and expecting to walk away unscathed. Ostensibly, in any disagreement I had with my parents, I would invariably be the one that would end up licking my wounds, so I avoided arguing with them about anything. My parents' lives were rigidly structured by laborious routines that served to make life tediously dull and exceedingly drudgerous, especially for a young man such as myself, that was aching to enjoy a little adventure in my life from time to time. But I'm sad to say that was wantonly denied to me, as my parents believed fun of any kind was frivolous, a waste of time, and a grotesque expedience that should never ever be indulged. I was the sad little boy growing up that was denied trips to the fair or circus, and at 5 years old I remember being told that Father Christmas was not real, and not to expect a stocking to be delivered to me from down the chimney, as it was all just a fairy tale. I was absolutely crushed by that. I know my parents weren't being deliberately cruel. They were trying their best to raise me in a way they thought would be suitable for me, and they thought indulging my imagination was setting me up for disappointment later on in my life. So it was best I knew that Santa didn't live in the North Pole, or slide down the chimney on a cold winter's night to leave behind a stocking for me on the mantel. So yes, I guess you could say I was poignantly aware, from a very early age, that my parents were very different to the other kids' parents that I knew. And I was quick to observe that other families indulged in much more excitement in their lives than I ever did. Our family never went away on holidays, as engaging in travel was once again a frivolous, unnecessary expense. As a kid, I envied other children when they were escorted away on exciting vacations for skiing holidays or leisurely holidays by the beach. I was the lonely kid that was stuck at home, twiddling my fingers aimlessly while I tried desperately to entertain myself. Tutors were sent to the house to teach me all kinds of subjects that I didn't learn at school, like how to speak German and French fluently. My mother was so rigidly disciplined. She did the family washing every Thursday afternoon, the ironing on Friday, and on Saturday morning she did the family shop. And I think she would have got quite flustered if something popped up unexpectedly during the day to unsettle the flow of her perfect routine. For when that happened, she would become decidedly anxious. My no-nonsense, rather aloof father was never inclined to smile or even crack a joke. He viewed life through a very serious lens and failed to see the humour in anything. If I made a joke, he'd stare at me through his black-rimmed spectacles and give me a funny look, as if he thought I was completely deranged. My father was a professor for a university, where he'd earned a formidable reputation among the students there, who, when they saw him coming, would walk across to the opposite side of the street in order to avoid any direct contact with him. Had I been wearing their shoes, I suspect I would have done exactly the same. My father had a tendency to growl if you asked a stupid question. I was informed that during my father's lectures, none of the students ever dared flinch in their seats, for fear of upsetting him, as he had quite the formidable temper on him if needs must, and believe me, I knew all about that, from bitter experience. So you really didn't want to make an enemy out of him, if you knew what was good for you, that is. My mother, on the other hand, failed to express her love to me growing up, but I'm not sure she'd ever loved anything in her life, not even my own father. But then again, my mother's own parents were the most insouciantly detached people you could ever hope to meet, so I guess she learnt from their example, and knew little about how to be a nurturing and loving parent. She worked in a science laboratory, testing biopsies that were sent to the laboratory from doctors to test for all manner of diseases, most notably cancer, on their patients. I guess growing up in a science background, where many of the subjects discussed around the dinner table revolved around medicine, it made it all the more likely that I myself would become a deeply cynical person under their dogmatic influences. My stiff, unyielding father was quick to put up his nose at any suggestion that there could be another life after death. He was so close-minded in that regard, about all things spiritual and supernatural, and in his dogged opinion, there absolutely was no God. People who went to church were ridiculously ignorant as far as my father was concerned. He believed that once you died, you pretty much were a goner, and that places like heaven only existed in the fertile imaginations of those who desperately hung on to religion like a life raft out in the ocean, so that they didn't have to face the horrifying, grueling reality that this life was all there was. "Religious people are so very foolish," he would often say. "How can anyone with brains believe in a God? I know, of course, why they do. It's because they're terribly afraid of death, afraid that once they've left this world, they'll be remembered no more. And sadly, they're right about that." My father's indomitable views had dominated my life from the day of my birth. So was it any wonder that I had become so sceptically scathing by the things I couldn't physically see with the naked eye? I thought people who believed in ghosts or cryptic creatures such as Bigfoot were either seriously delusional or making things up as they went along, just to draw attention to themselves, although I couldn't understand why anyone would want to do that, especially if it made them an object of ridicule. I guess the universe has a great sense of humour and enjoys having the last laugh from skeptics such as myself. As little did I realise, I would have 2 outlandish encounters in my young life that would throw everything I thought I knew about this reality and about this world flat on its face. I guess I had what I can only describe as a rude, rather brutal awakening, for there is something exceedingly arrogant and opinionated about people like my father, falsely assuming they know it all, when in reality they are blindingly ignorant about so many things and fail to fathom it, which is a sad truth. My father was like one of those closed oyster shells you haul up in a net from a fishing trip and throw out onto the deck, and then with a knife, well, a very sharp knife that is, you try and open the shell, and it refuses to budge because it is so tightly closed, so you just haul it back into the ocean, for it is good for nothing. Unfortunately, until the age of 18 years old, my views of the world were very limited, but that would soon dramatically change. I misleadingly believed I had a good grasp on how this world was put together, and how our reality works. I heard one wise man say once, "A fool thinks he knows everything, but it is a salient man that is well aware that he doesn't even know nearly enough." And never was a truer word ever spoken. I really believe a man should never be so pompous as to believe he has it all figured out, because he should be well aware that there is much he really does not understand. I was one of those annoying kids at school that was a firm favourite with all the teachers, and likely the type of kid many people love to hate, as it would seem everything was smooth sailing and effortless for me, and it appeared on the surface that I was enviably good at everything I attempted to do, especially when it came to math, science, and even sport. But then again, I was not afforded the luxury of being lazy or complacent. Ostensibly, my demanding, overbearing parents oversaw the helm of our ship, and I couldn't afford to go adrift, although, believe me, the temptation was always there, when a rebellious streak inside of me would rise up like a belligerent, angry, untamed ocean wave that was eager to defy my parents' will. But like the wimp I so obviously was back then, I would recoil and shrink away to avoid any cantankerous outbursts with my father. I was absolutely terrified to stand up to him and face his wrath. My father expected any kid of his to excel in school, for if I failed to do well in my grades, that would reflect poorly on him. And let's just say, my father had quite the ego on him. So much so, in fact, that at times my father rather reminded me of a conceited, puffed-up penguin that was inflated with so much hot air because he had such a high opinion of himself. I rather think that if I had been raised by more carefree parents, who were easy-going and free-spirited, and who hadn't put pressure on me, I would have been a lot lazier at school, sloppy about my homework, and probably only getting B's instead of A's, which I'm quite certain would have made me more popular with the other boys in my class. To all intents and purposes, under my dad's indomitable stranglehold, only straight A's were acceptable in our household, and had my grades dared to slip to below an A, I dread to think how my formidable father would have reacted to that. But I would have been too afraid to test those choppy, tumultuous waters, as no one willingly would put their finger in a tank filled with piranhas, unless they wanted their hand to be bitten off, and back then I knew what was good for me. There was a small part of me that resented my parents' high expectations that they doggedly enforced upon me. Their demands for me to succeed drained much of the fun out of my young life. So much of my time was devoted to my studies, and while other kids were enjoying their teenage years, I was the one sitting at home, dutifully fulfilling the wishes of my parents, and too afraid to put a foot out of line, almost as if I was a soldier in the military, caught under the watchful eye of the domineering sergeant in charge, who would likely have me do 1,000 push-ups if I even got a drop of dust on my boot. Likewise, my father believed my academic performance at school was a prerequisite to accomplishing my goals in life, as without education I would be as useless as a gnat, and I remember him saying as much. Later on in my young life I was to learn that education is overrated, as sometimes the greatest wisdom comes from our life experiences, and of that I'm in no doubt. Sometimes a man who's lived on the streets might have a greater understanding of the world and the toughness of life than someone who has attended the finest universities, for the arrogance that comes with such accomplishments never ceases to amaze me, and some of the most advantaged and privileged people of our time can be the most narrow-minded of all. I do remember there was always a deep longing in my heart that I simply refused to acknowledge, a voice in the depths of my soul that nudged me to pay close attention, almost as if something was telling me to open my eyes, because this world was much more complicated, complex, and mysterious than I could have ever imagined it to be. And even back in his day, Tesla said as much, and as my father was an admirer of Tesla, I'm surprised he failed to realize how scientific and spiritual the man was at the very same time. I told myself in my ignorance that this was the voice of my imagination speaking to me, that I should always keep in check, in case it got grossly out of hand, because an imagination does not easily mix with science. It's like putting oil and water together in a glass jar. the oil will quickly rise to the surface and refuses to mix with the water. My outlandish story started when I was about 18 years old, when my view of reality was about to do a complete 180. I remember it was the 21st of May 1984, and after I'd finished my studies, I'd cycled over to the O'Connor house, where I was close friends with the two O'Connor brothers, who had become to me like the brothers I wished for and never had, and to this day I consider them family. I remember it was a beautiful afternoon in spring, with the sun casting its light shadows across the street, where the sycamore trees lined both sides of the pavement, and they shimmered with a twinkling glaze from the reflectant gossamer light. I hoped the good weather would last, for in this part of Washington state the weather was as mischievous as a misbehaving spouse that is clandestinely having an affair behind her husband's back. I had taken out my mountain bike and cycled past the elegant row houses, with their pristine front lawns of perfectly manicured green grass, and flower beds ablaze with pretty garden shrubs. It was unusually quiet that afternoon, although the sweet twitters of pretty bird song was quite pronounced. Beyond that there had been almost no activity on our street at all. I had seen old Mrs. Markham from number 42 walking her two grey schnauzers, Polly and Percy, which she did so religiously, come rain or shine, at the very same time each day, which was pretty admirable if you ask me, for a woman of her advancing age. But she would always say, if you don't use it, you lose it. Mrs. Markham was an extremely fit elderly woman. She put some women half her age to shame. She was agile, quick-witted, and extremely sharp, and beyond that, a very likeable person. She threw me a friendly wave with her veiny, somewhat arthritic hand, and called after me, "How are you, Dylan?" "I'm fine, Mrs. Markham," I said with a cheery tone to my voice. "How are you?" I stopped my bicycle on the street opposite her, to be polite, and to have a quick chat with the woman, whom I was well aware lived on her own, and probably got lonely occasionally. "More to the point," I said teasingly, "how are Polly and Percy over here?" When I mentioned her two adorable schnauzers, who were like medium-sized teddy bears, Mrs. Markham's face burst into a bright smile, and her grey-blue eyes twinkled. "Oh, they're as mischievous as ever, let me tell you, Dylan," she told me proudly, looking down at her dogs adoringly. "Percy, as usual, tries to gobble up poor Molly's food at dinner times. I have to watch him like a hawk, you know. One time he managed to grab a bag of chicken breasts I'd bought from shopping, and the cheeky bugger devoured them all. I searched high and low for those chicken breasts, let me tell you, and almost went to the shop, all the way back, to ask them if they'd forgotten to put them in my grocery bag. I thought I'd left them behind. But let's just say, after Percy had eaten 12 raw chicken breasts, he threw them all up. So I knew who the guilty party was. The bugger had stolen them from me, and he looked at me as if butter wouldn't melt in his mouth. He is so naughty, but I can't help loving him all the same." "That's hilarious, Mrs. Markham," I said, unable to stop laughing. "Oh, believe me, Dylan, don't be deceived by these grey balls of fluff. They keep me on my toes, let me tell you," she chuckled. Both her schnauzers were lifting their legs up against a tree to leave their signatures behind, and then sniffing the grassy verge. Mrs. Markham had told me that Polly and Percy had become like children to her after her husband Bob died 5 years ago. She had shared with me quite candidly that she had lost the will to live after his death, but then her daughter Veronica had brought her 2 schnauzer pups, a boy and a girl, that she had chosen to call Polly and Percy. She claimed the dogs had given her a new lease of life. "You know, Dylan," she told me, "the best thing my daughter Veronica ever did for me was to get me those schnauzers. I was reluctant to keep them, of course, at my advanced age, but Veronica assured me that if anything were to happen to me, she would take care of the dogs, which is a huge weight off my mind, let me tell you. But with Polly and Percy around me all day long, I no longer feel so desperately alone. They always put a smile on my face every day, let me tell you." Mrs. Markham was in her late 80s, approaching her 90s, and there wasn't a day that didn't go by that she didn't grieve her husband's, Bob's, passing. Bob Markham's grave was at the local cemetery at the bottom of our road. Every day after Mrs. Markham had walked the dogs, she would take them back home and walk down the road again to the cemetery, where she dutifully lay flowers at her husband's grave. Indeed, she never missed a day in going to visit his marble slab, engraved with the words, "Rest in peace, Bob. You'll be sorely missed." Mrs. Markham would say to me, "I know he's probably not around his gravesite, but going to visit him every day at the cemetery. It's a point of contact, you see, if you know what I mean. It makes me feel very much as if he's still around." I was someone who didn't believe in life after death, let alone the likelihood that in death Bob Markham would hang around his gravesite. As far as I was concerned, if there was life after death, or consciousness that is, I'd likely explore the entire universe and all its dimensions, rather than hang around my gravesite at a cemetery. I humoured Mrs. Markham, as she was such a sweet lady, and said, "I'm sure he's still very much around, Mrs. Markham." In truth, I didn't believe a word of it, but I knew my reassuring words brought her some comfort. She looked at me reflectively through her grey-blue eyes and said, "What a nice thing for you to say, Dylan. So very comforting you are. You're a thoughtful young man, you know. You really think Bob is still around, do you?" I hated to lie to Mrs. Markham, because she looked so hopeful, as if she was hanging on to my every word. So I said, "But of course he's around you, Mrs. Markham. I don't doubt that for a second." The gloomy, oppressive-looking cemetery at the bottom of our street accommodated graves going back through the centuries. Some were so incredibly ancient and decrepit, they had long since been forgotten about and abandoned. Such forlorn, forsaken graves, I'd been told by my own mother, were hidden at the very back of the cemetery, in front of the wooded area that stretched back for many miles. Most of these now unmarked graves, due to the hands of time and erosion, had lost their engravings and were now covered in moss and lichen. That part of the cemetery was heavily overgrown, with wild grasses and weeds, for not even the caretaker paid attention to them, which at the time I thought was an awful shame. For some reason he wantonly ignored those ancient graves. It was as if he had an insouciant attitude towards them, as they were no longer visited by loved ones, as I rather suspect the loved ones had also passed away. I personally preferred to avoid the cemetery at all costs, not because I was remotely superstitious, nor did I believe in ghosts for that matter, but the place gave off an airy, rather sinister vibe that gave you the chills. Put it this way, I would not have liked to have been buried in that cemetery. Over the years, rumours abounded that the cemetery at the bottom of our street was haunted, but my father had said that that was poppycock, which I believe were the exact words he used. "What nonsense!" he would say. "There is no such thing as ghosts, and there is no way the place is haunted. What is wrong with people? They can be so damn gullible and naive." My mother at least had the good grace to gingerly admit that the cemetery at the bottom of our road looked pretty spooky, and even if ghosts didn't exist, that she wouldn't want to be seen wandering around that cemetery, especially not at the dead of night. The cemetery was on a large, extensive property, which stretched out into a heavily wooded area in Washington state, and there were very few locals that seemed to visit the old cemetery. It was more drifters from the outside areas that tended to visit it. I often privately wondered if they too had picked up on the airy vibe of the place, for believe me, I'd seen other cemeteries in my time that I'd actually enjoyed visiting, but the one at the bottom of our street was very creepy in every sense of the word. Once I'd enjoyed a chat with Mrs. Markham. I bid her farewell. I then cycled towards the twee little house close to the end of the cul-de-sac, not too far away from the cemetery. The O'Connor house was like a doll's house. It was perfectly symmetrical, with red terracotta roof tiles, white walls and spacious bay windows that overlooked prepossessing views onto the street. They had a gravel drive and a perfectly manicured front yard, along with a water fountain and a pond teeming with koi carp. Some of these koi carp were incredibly impressive in size, and they didn't mind it when you dipped your hands into the water and stroked them, which I often did. I was looking forward to seeing the O'Connor brothers again. who I considered to be my best friends. They were a year apart in age, with Ethan being the oldest, but they might as well have been twins, for they had so much in common and were passionate about music. They belonged to a trendy boy band that played jazzy music at the local bar in town, and they were paid for the privilege, for people flocked to listen to them. I had heard via the grapevine that they had returned from their fishing trip. I had known Nicholas and Ethan since the grasshopper years of my life, and although they were so different to me in every sense of the word, for some reason we got along famously, and our extreme differences appeared to complement each other. It was ironic because Nicholas and Ethan had the most easygoing parents who had never applied any pressure or expectations on their children. They hadn't forced them to succeed at school like mine had done. I remember growing up, secretly wishing with all my heart we could actually exchange parents and do an outright swap like you did with stickers or stamps in those days. I'd have loved to have been raised by parents as fun-loving as the O'Connors, who were so wholesome in every single regard. I'd often teased Nicholas and Ethan for believing in the possibility of ghosts existing. They were open-minded about cryptic creatures as well, which I always found incredibly strange, but growing up, they had been encouraged to think outside the box. That made them much wiser and more discerning than I actually was at the time. I couldn't fathom how my two best friends could be so open-minded into believing in such paradoxical things as ghosts, cryptid creatures, and even aliens from outer space. Nicholas had told me once that the planet is so very large, with so much uncharted wilderness around the globe, and anything could be out there. Nicholas went as far as to say that maybe creatures like the woolly mammoth were still hanging around parts of our planet, not easily accessible to humans. "It's a possibility," he would say emphatically, and I would nod my head and say, "Maybe," when really I thought the idea was nothing short of ludicrous. I would secretly wonder what my father would say about that. He'd likely conclude I was hanging around a bunch of imbeciles that had cotton wool for brains, but I assure you there was nothing backward about the O'Connor brothers, who were both extremely savvy. When I arrived at the O'Connor household that breezy afternoon and rang the doorbell, Mrs. O'Connor answered the door to me, greeting me with a warm, sincere smile. She was pleased to see me, and enveloped me in her arms, giving me a generous hug. She always smelt of honey soap, and I found the smell of her very comforting. She was the only adult that had ever hugged me in my young life, for my parents abhorred any kind of physical demonstrations of affection. I could see Mrs. O'Connor was extremely happy to have her boys back from their fishing trip. She got lonely without them around, as her husband worked on an oil rig, I believe it was, so she didn't see him very often. "Oh, there you are, Dylan," she teased. "I wondered how long it would take you to turn up here. No doubt you've heard Ethan and Nicholas are back from their fishing trip." "Yes, I heard," I said. "News travels very fast around here, does it not?" said Mrs. O'Connor with a big smile. She beckoned me into the house, closing the front door behind the both of us. She nodded towards the large sweeping staircase. "Why don't you go upstairs, Dylan? Nicholas and Ethan are playing their drums as usual, in the recreation room. It's the first thing they did, you know, when they got home. It's so typical of them, isn't it? Music is their life. I think they missed their drums more than they missed their own mother. I actually found this house alarmingly quiet when they were gone, and with the husband not being around, I didn't know what to do with myself. It was so desperately lonely here without them all, you know." "Well, they're back now, Mrs. O'Connor," I teased, giving her a wink. "I'm quite sure after a couple of days you'll wish they were gone already." "I don't think so, Dylan. I like having my boys around, and I enjoy your company as well. Now you go upstairs, will you? I will bring you and the boys some hot chocolate and brownies in a moment. I've made your favourite, Dylan, the ones you like with the walnuts." "Sounds yummy, Mrs. O'Connor. You know how I feel about your walnut chocolate brownies." I saluted her as I dashed up the staircase as quickly as I possibly could, for it had been pretty lonely in the street, without the company of my two best friends. I was eager to hear all about their fishing trip. As I approached the recreation room, I smiled as I heard the heavy drumming sounds of Nicholas and Ethan blasting away at their drums, for they were obsessed with music, and in any spare time they could grab, they'd be back at the drums. When I entered the recreation room, they stopped drumming at once and beckoned for me to take a seat on the black leather couch that was situated under a huge poster of Madonna that was strategically placed on the central wall. I think it was Nicholas who walked over to the vintage refrigerator and pulled out a Coke for me. He threw it at me and I caught it thankfully in my hand, and eagerly pulled back the ring pull and took some refreshing gulps of the fizzy drink. "How was the trip?" I asked them. "Did you manage to catch any decent-sized fish? I suppose you didn't." Ethan and Nicholas appeared to exchange furtive glances between each other. Nicholas finally nodded rather soberly. "Tell him," he said. "Not that I think that Dylan is going to believe a word of our story, but I still want him to hear it." "Tell me what?" I asked, raising a brow, looking from one brother to the next. Ethan then said very matter-of-factly, "I think we saw a ghost on our trip. Either that or something else that was outer-worldly, definitely demonic. It's a long story, really. But yes, I think we can safely say we saw a ghost. There, I've said it. It sounds weird saying it out loud for some reason." At this I sat up straight on the edge of the black leather settee. I grinned at both of them broadly. "Yeah, right. That's it. You schemingly thought you'd wind me up, did you, when you got back from your fishing trip? Is that it? So you saw a ghost on your fishing trip, did you?" I said sarcastically. "And my grandmother grew a bushy beard while you were away. You're calling my bluff, aren't you? I know when someone is trying to pull my leg." Nicholas suddenly grew sullen. "This is not a joke, bro," he said, his eyes suddenly widening. "I tell you, Dylan, I've never been so frightened in my entire life. We saw a ghost. Well, that's what I believe it was. And I was attacked by the thing. But whatever it was insanely evil." "What happened?" I asked, my curiosity now getting the better of me. For judging by the serious tones of my best friends' voices, I realized that this was no wind-up. Did the O'Connor brothers just tell me very casually that they'd seen a ghost on their fishing holiday? This was hard for me to assimilate, and I was sure they had to be mistaken. Perhaps it was a trick of the light, I thought. The eyes can be so easily deceived, can't they? And sometimes we believe we've seen things that we really haven't. As in the dark, ambiguous shadows, our highly impressionable imaginations can get way out of hand. Nicholas took a sip of his Coke. He paused briefly for a moment. He seemed somewhat reflective. "Well, our cabin that we were renting was one of many situated along a very large lake. All the cabins looked much the same, rather basic and rudimentary. They occupied different parts of the lake, so to speak. So you would wake up in the early morning to enjoy spectacular views over the sparkling water that incidentally was teeming with fish, but it didn't mean it was easy to catch them, let me tell you. Anyway, there is a village not far from the cabins, where you'll find a few shops that will sell you everything you need, so you don't have to go to the main town for anything, which is jolly useful if you want to spend most of your time fishing, which is what we both wanted to do. We were determined to improve on our fishing techniques, which I have to say are still pretty lousy. The village makes a lot of money from holiday makers that visit the area regularly. I believe business is booming for them, but the shops are very appealing, if you know what I mean. They have that vintage look about them, with pretty hanging baskets all over the place, and those keg barrels tumbling over with geraniums and petunias. The streets are also cobbled, so it has a historic atmosphere, if you know what I mean. When we were in the village, we discovered there was a bakery, a delicatessens, a pizza restaurant, a Chinese takeaway, an ice cream parlour, a grocery shop, a butcher, and a sports shop selling everything you could possibly need, from fishing tackle, horse riding gear, winter sports stuff, and more besides. And then there are a few little boutiques selling trinkets and some fashionable clothes. It's a charming village, if you know what I mean. The kind of place where everybody knows each other. The locals are very friendly, and they welcomed us, making us feel right at home. The place has a charming atmosphere." "Sounds great," I said enviously, for I knew that I never had the privilege of going away. I was privately wondering at this point where the ghost they claimed to have seen fit it into their story. Go on, I encouraged. Well, when we began our fishing holiday, one of the holiday makers staying in a cabin adjacent to ours, on the opposite side of the lake, was a very friendly man called Mark Patton, who had one leg that had been amputated from under the knee. He had a prosthetic foot and walked with a notable limp. He lost half his leg in the Vietnam War, you see. In the 1960s, I believe it was. He said a shell went flying past him and missed him, but then he suddenly felt a stinging, rather burning sensation in his lower leg. The leg just buckled under him. The pain was immense. He found himself looking at his shattered leg, and it was so gruesome, so much so he passed out. But when he came around, he found himself in a makeshift hospital, and a pretty nurse was attending to him. He asked her if he was in heaven. She laughed at him and said, "No, you're in hospital. You shattered your lower leg. It was a shell, I'm afraid." He asked her if she was an angel, and she said, "No, I'm not." He said he was disappointed that the pretty woman wasn't an angel, but nevertheless he still ended up marrying her. "Wow, that's a cool story," I said. So there we are. That is the end of part 1 of our story. Part 2 is tomorrow night. I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.